Mic's on. Dun, dun, dun. Nearly got a thumbs up, hold on. Okay, we've got the thumbs up. Oh my goodness. We're all awake. That's nice. Don't need a coffee now. That's good. Hello and welcome to the news meeting live. I'm glad that you're... Okay, this is good. This is good. You're going to have to participate. Anyone been to a live podcast recording before? Okay, nice. You can attest to the fact that we need you to be involved. We want our listeners on Friday, when this is released, to hear you in the room. So, if someone says something funny, laugh. If something's controversial, you can object. And in the meantime, we need to practice some applause. So I've got my glamorous assistant, Mark, who's got this high-tech sign. No, you need more whooping, because you can identify a whooping in Friday's edition. So we're going to have a sustained clapping, whooping experience. As long as Mark has a sign up, you must be clapping and whooping. Okay. Okay, brilliant. So throughout, feel like you can be involved. At the end, you will literally need to be involved. So James will make his decision on which story he thinks should lead. You might agree and be enthusiastic about that. You might disagree, or you might think he missed the most obvious story and no one else pitched it, in which case that's your opportunity. So if the tech is all good, on this end, Rachel, wave if you think it's going well tech-wise.
Can I just point out that I got a script that says Mark holds up sign. So, yeah, I wanted to share the magic of how it was made.
This is high-tech podcasting. Welcome, welcome. Rachel, are you happy your end? Okay, this is the next character, Lewis, who is going to be in charge of the podcast audio. Lewis, are you happy your end?
Give him away.
Should we do some testing?
Could you get James to say something?
James.
Hello.
Oh, that's so nice.
More words,
Oh, you
James.
want more words?
More words.
Hello, welcome.
That's great.
Quite a busy
Okay, enough
news
words.
week.
Enough words.
That's
Katie.
enough.
I don't want to spoil it.
Hi, Katie.
Hello, welcome.
Hi.
It's Katie.
Hi, Katie.
Gabby.
Hello, I don't know why I agreed to do this.
And Liz.
Hello, I have to do this. It's
Lovely. Is everyone in tech happy? Lewis? Rachel? We will begin. Applause.
Hello, I'm James Harding. This news meeting is recorded here in our Tortoise Newsroom in front of a live audience. Welcome to you all. And welcome to Liz Mosley, to Gabby Hinsliff, to Katie Gunning. It's great to see you all here.
Hello.
We are in a bit going to come to the whole project of the news meeting, trying to work out what should lead the news and why. And as you may notice, if you've listened to the news meeting, in the last few weeks, we've tried to make sure that we get the most from everyone who's listening. People can email in, and for our live audience, we're going to try and hear from you. You'll pass judgment on whether we've made the right call on what's leading the news, or frankly, whether we've missed the story that should be in it in the first place. And if you're listening to this podcast, you can do the same by emailing us. Just email newsmeeting@tortoisemedia.com. Newsmeeting@tortoisemedia.com. Okay, let's get on with things. From Tortoise, welcome to the news meeting. So what I said, I'm going to say that again. Joining me on stage are Tortoise journalists Liz Mosley and Katie Gunning. Thank you, Katie.
Hello.
Thank you, Liz. And I'm very excited to say, the Guardian columnist Gabby Hinsliff, who did a great piece for us. We were thinking, Gabby, a couple of years ago, the profile on Keir Starmer.
Yes, whoever he was then.
Well, no, I think the thing that you did then, which was rather brilliant, if I might say, was to go back and look at his legal career, look at the cases he prosecuted and his choices as DPP to try and make sense of who he is.
Because we had, that's all we had to go on, really, at that stage. He was a fairly unknown political quantity, so it was interesting to kind of dig back into the bit. You know, it's unusual to have someone who has such a profile in public life before politics, and it was worth exploring that.
And interestingly, of course, what we discovered about him then is what the whole country is discovering now. Not that ideological, extremely pragmatic.
Yes, and I think that's one of the things we're going to talk about tonight. But yeah, it was an interesting exercise. It was all Tortoise's idea, I have to say.
All right. Well, let's come. Oh, I'm excited by what that means. Let's come to long story short. So, What I'd love to hear is, in a phrase, in a sentence, what you think is the story that should lead the news. Katie, why don't you go first?
Food fight.
Food fight, that's pithy. Gabby?
Obscene and inhumane. Starmer pushes Labour to the limits.
Obscene and inhumane, Starmer pushes Labour to the limits. Oh, I see. So obscene and inhumane is the headline.
It is. And then my
Strap.
strap is Labour pushes.
Got it. Liz?
Going postal.
Oh, I think I know where we're going with that. I'm keen to hear about that. But Katie, why don't we start with you? Food fight.
Food fight. And if that sounds flippant, it's not meant to. In fact, just before we started recording this podcast, the news story emerged that Russian missiles have attacked the southern, the Black Sea coast in Ukraine and have destroyed 60,000 tons of grain. Now, that comes just 48 hours, just slightly under 48 hours, since Russia withdrew from a deal which allows Ukrainian grain and oilseed exports to go through the Black Sea. It was brokered a year ago and was kind of groundbreaking at the time because it basically allowed this safe passage through a kind of 3 nautical mile wide stretch of the Black Sea. And it allowed, and over the course of the last year, 33 million metric tons have been exported. We're talking things like sunflower oil, barley, maize, wheat. And crucially, more than a half of that has gone to developing countries. And that's why this story matters, because by withdrawing from that deal, the people who are going to lose out are the world's poorest nations. And it came to a juddering halt at midnight on Monday, just into Tuesday. And since then, Russia, they've hit Odessa and Mykolaiv already with missiles, and now we've got this story that they've also destroyed these grain silos, also near Odessa.
Can we just do the deal and the military attack separately? The deal was due to expire at the end of the year, or was this an act of retribution in itself?
It was due to expire and was due to be renewed. It's been renewed a couple of times along the way. And one of the things that is worth knowing about the deal is that the way it worked was that Russia was allowed to monitor the exports going out of 3 Ukrainian ports. They were also allowed to check the ships leaving the Bosphorus Strait going up to Ukraine to check they weren't carrying weapons and arms. And so it was a deal that was generally seen to be useful on both sides, and that's why it kept being renewed. It was due to be renewed because it's almost exactly a year ago since it was brokered. But it's been faltering, and then for various reasons, there was the attack on the Kerch Bridge also on Monday, the early hours of Monday morning. But Russia is also saying that they're pulling out because not enough food has made it to the world's poorest nations. And they want certain things. They want their agricultural bank to be allowed to access this SWIFT banking system. The rest of the world are not going to be keen on that because they know that that bank has already, that there's evidence that it would be used for other things that are subject to sanctions. And they want more flexibility on their fertilizer exports. So fertilizers are exempt from sanctions. They can still export them. But the Russians say that ammonia, that they want it to be easier for them to export ammonia, and that's not happening. And they're saying that if these things aren't allowed, then the deal won't restart.
Did I ever tell you that my first proper beat reporting job was as an agriculture correspondent? So all this talk of fertilizer, ammonia,
Love it.
It just takes me back.
Yeah.
That said, this story seems to go in 2 directions, just on the deal itself. As you say, impact on developing countries, demand for grain, fertilizer, presumably year-out impacts on famine, migration, security. What about inside Ukraine?
Well, the big losers obviously are going to be Ukraine themselves. So Russia will be keen to affect their finances. And Ukrainian farmers are going to be the hardest hit because obviously they are going to find their trade dry.
So Katie, is this element of the story combined with what we begin to hear about stalling Ukrainian offensive, a bigger story about things turning in Ukraine and things turning in Vladimir Putin's favour in Ukraine?
I don't know if it shows that they're turning in his favour, but I think it must all be part of a bigger story of that offensive, because the fact that these missile attacks that we've now seen around Odessa, which was possibly in retaliation to the attack on the bridge, I think it's impossible to tell. It feels impossible to tell how it's actually going for Russia or Ukraine. I wouldn't want to give a verdict on that, but I think it must all be connected, because it feels like a ratcheting up, and it fits in slightly to Putin's playbook of trying to sow disorder around the globe, because if you get food shortages in countries in the global south, that causes unrest. And so, and there's also a feeling that that they're slightly holding some of those countries to ransom, that if you don't support Russia during this war, then this is the sort of thing that will come to pass, because we can shut off the supply of food that's making its way to you.
Gabby, what do you think?
When I was thinking about what story I wanted to talk about this week, I mean, this is one of the ones that I was really drawn by, because it's got a bit of everything. You know, it's got obviously very serious humanitarian consequences if grain doesn't get through to emerging countries. I mean, it pushes up, in developed countries as well, pushes up wheat prices, you know, and we've seen food inflation's only just starting to fall here now. You know, we've seen how painful that's been. And there's also potentially, I would think, you know, there are potentially military consequences. The Ukrainians have been saying that if the deal fell through, they would try and get their grain out anyway. Does that mean we end up with conflicts in the Black Sea? Does that potential risk of Turkey being drawn in? You know, suddenly you find the conflict, you know, possibly developing. What probably put me off doing it was that if this deal hadn't been brokered a year ago, it would have been disastrous. We've had a year of it, and a year of, I think, countries assuming that it might not last forever. That's been time to develop plan Bs, alternative routes out of grain from Ukraine, alternative, you know, up grain production in other parts of the world. We've had, to an extent, chances to adapt. So maybe the breaking of the deal now doesn't have the effect that it would have had 6 months ago. But it's a big, complicated story with lots of moving parts. And it's one of those that you think you might look back in 6 months' time and go, oh, that's where X started. You know, that was a tipping point.
Liz, what do you think?
For all the reasons Gabby said, she was drawn to this story with the reasons why I ran a mile. Because I'm rubbish at chess and that's what this war is. It's a sort of a horrible, massive game of chess. I can't see the ramifications. I can't game them out in my mind. I do remember the deal being done and breathing a big sigh of relief when it happened. I don't know what the plan Bs are that have been developed in the intervening period. And so on that basis, I feel totally ill-equipped to gauge the story.
The one thing that I'm reminded, listening to you, Gabby, about the knock-on impacts and plan Bs and alternative sources of food, was that at the time, and we did that podcast, in fact, I did the podcast on Odessa at the time when there was an attempt by the World Food Programme to orchestrate this deal. What they were saying was you would see so many people dealing with famine, dealing with food insecurity, you would see much, much more instability within Africa. And if you look at it, what they forecast has happened. If you look at Sudan, if you look at Burkina Faso, if you look at countries, if you look at Mali, what they forecast was driven by food prices. Presumably, there weren't plan Bs put in place because the food deal was done and people have hoped that this war would be resolved by now.
Well, there has been some grain heading. There is more that's heading across through European routes. They've got this issue with the rail gauges. If you remember, you know, they have different rail gauges in Ukraine to the rest of Europe. So moving it that way is hard. But there's the Danube, but it's much slower. You can't move as much grain as you can move by ship. So it does slow it down.
Does this story fail to make it as a lead story because it's in that category of, you know, that thing you haven't heard of, it's not happening? I.e., you know the deal that you probably weren't paying attention to, it's fallen through, a kind of expiry that happens.
But you were allowed not to pay attention because it was just ticking along. It was oiling the wheels of the global sort of trade of food going around the world. But now that it's broken, you need to sit up and take notice.
And is there anyone taking notice? I don't hear a lot of noise about it. I hear a lot of noise about the military attacks, but I remember being told once by a Polish former defense minister that invasions are won militarily and lost economically. If that's the case, you would have thought lots of people would be making noise because this is a moment where Ukraine is in much more peril than we appreciate.
Yeah, and we aren't hearing that much about it, and we're not hearing, at the same time, Russia's apparently trying to, while it's trying to disrupt routes across the Black Sea, it's working on trying to improve its routes across the Caspian Sea, which is a whole route that has no NATO countries around it, and they can merrily have, weapons and food go either way, and we hear nothing about that. So it's got these other elements that we don't hear about.
Gabby, would you shy away from choosing it as a lead story because it's technical, it's agriculture, it's a interim deal, or do you think it has the makings of a story that would lead?
Obviously, I'd rather it have my story. But no, if I had, I think, if I'm honest, I think it suffers from something that all journalists feel guilty about talking about, but which is true nonetheless, which is that foreign news often struggles to make a lead against domestic because it feels a bit remote and a bit far away, even though the impacts of it would absolutely be felt here in terms of rising wheat prices. And it's also a story of lots of ifs. If this doesn't happen, if it's definite that no deal can be done because there's still efforts to rebroker a deal, if the plan Bs fall apart, if this, there are lots of it feels to me like one you keep an absolute watching brief on because it could blow up into something huge, and this could be the beginning of a whole new phase in the Ukrainian conflict, or it could not. And I feel like I can't quite tell at the moment which of those two things it is.
Liz, you're not in love with it.
I'm not in love with it, but that's a me problem, not a story problem, I think. I've got really acute Ukraine fatigue.
We're going to make sure that we have time for the you problem when we get to your story.
It'll go on a bit for that section.
Let's go to Gabby's.
Okay. So my story, Obscene and Inhumane, is a quote from Angela Rayner, for those who don't recognise it. And the story is about Keir Starmer saying that Labour won't scrap the two-child limit on benefits if it gets into government. But it's really a story about so much more. It's about how far Labour will go to win. But crucially also about whether, if it does win, it can actually manage to govern without sort of physically imploding under the pressure of governing in the sort of economic circumstances it's going to face. So for those who don't, just to recap, for those who don't remember the policy, it's the one George Osborne introduced, which says that basically the state will give you benefits, child tax credit, universal credit, whatever, for your first two children, and after that, basically, you're on your own. So if you have another child, forget it. There's no more money. And it was introduced during the austerity period. Supposedly, the idea was that people shouldn't have children that they couldn't afford, but as anybody here who has children will recognise, real life doesn't always necessarily work like that. The obvious problem was people who, say, had 3 or 4 children were doing fine, weren't reliant on welfare, and then someone loses their job, you fall back on the benefit system, and suddenly, the state will pay for 2 of your children, but not 3. So there's an obvious impact on large families. There were obvious implications for women in abusive relationships. Not everyone gets to choose whether or not they continue with a pregnancy or not. And there were also, there was just life getting in the way. The urge to have a baby isn't always rational. So what you got in the end wasn't, the sort of clean solution the Treasury wanted. What you got was 250,000 more children in poverty. And a sort of miserable situation for them, but also with knock-on consequences for the public purse. We know that child poverty has, lifelong costs and implications. It was really, it was controversial when the Tories did it. It was controversial within the Conservative Party, and it was hugely controversial within the Labour Party. Everyone hated it. It's the Brexit of welfare policies, essentially. It's a bad idea, but very popular with the public. And it's at the same time hated by Labour activists. And that is absolute kryptonite for the Labour Party, that situation where it's forced to choose between target voters and its own supporters at a time when, Labour is desperate to show that it can make tough fiscal choices, that, it can keep a tight rein on the public purse. It's an expensive policy to revoke. So what you've got here is essentially a political virility test for Keir Starmer. Can he face down a revolt within the Labour Party? Can he sort of lead the party with him? But it's also a kind of harbinger of what might be to come for Labour in government, because there are going to be other choices like this. There's going to be a lot of things that Labour is going to have to say no to, that its natural supporters are going to hate it saying no to, that you're going to hear people saying, well, what's the point of having Labour in power if it can't even do this? So does Keir Starmer have the sort of political skills to navigate through that? I picked this story for 2 reasons, partly because it's got legs. I think the reporter in me can see lots of different ways in which this story could run on, which I'm very happy to talk about. But also, the columnist in me likes it because it's a mixture of high politics and human stories. This isn't just some Beltway Westminster story. There are real lives at stake here. And there are, I would say, emotional and ethical consequences to this. What we're talking about is whether the state has a right to determine how many children you have. You know, is that the kind of human decision that we want government to be stepping into? What are the rights and wrongs of that? You know, there are all sorts of, so many different ways that you can come at this story that it seemed to me, whether you're a tabloid or a broadsheet reporter or a columnist, you know, a magazine or broadcast, this feels like the most interesting story of the week to me.
Gabby, how much would it cost if you lift the two-child limit?
The estimate is 1.3 billion, and it would depend, of course, we don't know exactly how many, depends how many children people have between now and the election, but yeah.
And people who make the point about the 250,000 in child poverty, how do they calculate the cost to the Treasury of dealing with the knock-on impacts on social care, health care, schooling? What sum do they come up with?
That is a slightly how long is a piece of string question, because it depends what you can. I mean, the Child Poverty Action Group's done the best calculations on it. So that's where the 250 million, that is saying that basically if you abolished it tomorrow, you'd lift 250,000 children out of poverty instantly. For another 850,000 children who are kind of further down the pile, you would alleviate their situation, but you wouldn't lift them above the breadline completely. When you think about the knock-on costs of children remaining in poverty for the next, you know, those knock-on costs to, for example, if you look at, you know, education, we know what happens to children on free school meals. We know that there's an attainment gap between them and other children. We know that there's a gap in attendance between children on free school meals and other children. We know that there are lifelong health consequences of poverty in childhood.
But just so we're saying, what we're really saying there is there's a 1.3 billion annual bill to the Treasury, and there is a long-term cost to society which has a knock-on economic costs, but it's very hard to put a number on it.
Yes, so it's not free, essentially, to maintain the policy as it is.
All right, so let's just go back to your point that says, actually, as a reporter, you can see lots of places this goes. Where?
Well, at the moment, if I was a lobby correspondent now, I would be running around looking for senior people in the Labour Party, looking for signs of dissent, looking for people in the shadow cabinet who didn't like this decision, looking for Labour grandees who will stand up and say, actually, I wouldn't be doing this. You know, yeah, everyone has already been chasing after Andy Burnham. I'm sure there are more. It's Labour's, and then I would be looking further on. So Labour's National Policy Forum this weekend, which is when, you know, it's a big sort of thrashing out session for what goes into the manifesto. So I would expect to see some revolt there behind closed doors. You know, we're not far away from Labour Party conference now. I could very easily see constituency parties putting in motions. Is there a showdown on the conference floor? You know, I don't think it's guaranteed, shall we say, that this goes through without a fuss.
But you said it's popular, this policy. So just talk through the politics, i.e. where this policy sits in the polls and what the Starmer calculation is.
So there is support for this policy in the polls, and I think what will be worrying the Labour Party particularly is that, like a lot of tough welfare policies, it's not opposed by the people that you might assume it would be. The people who are probably keenest on it are people on relatively low incomes themselves, but just above the threshold at which this kicks in. And that's who Osborne was appealing to in the first place. He was saying, look, plenty of people...
It was George Osborne who introduced
it was Osborne's original policy, and he was appealing to people who were, you know, feeling a bit cash-strapped themselves, but not reliant on benefits, and saying to them, well, look, you'd have to think about it. You might want to have a bigger family than you do, but you don't do that because you have to think about how much, you know, whether you can afford it, and people on benefits should have to think about that too. So that's why Labour's in part sticking to what it's doing. The other reason it's digging in is simply because it wants to make a point about fiscal prudence. You know, we haven't got the money to do all the things we'd like to do. This is a line in the sand.
But just to put myself in the shoes of people sitting in the leader of the opposition's office, their frustration with journalism is that, of course, we go burrowing after Andy Burnham, who's opposed to the policy, you know, those people who are going to come out and say that Keir Starmer's doing the wrong thing. We don't go and chase down the members of the public or the people making the political calculation that shows the majority of people are in favour of the policy. How do we get after that point of view and understand where that lies and the reasons for it?
I think that depends which I don't know at this stage which publication I'm working for. If I'm working for the Daily Mail, I'm running around looking for the people who think this is, you know, who think this is a great policy. If I'm working for the Guardian, I'm not. So, but I think
is that true,
the media as a whole.
Hold on, Gabby. Do you think that's true?
What?
Do you think that if you work for the Mail, you're saying let's go and find someone who's for it, and if you're the Labour, if the Guardian, you go and let's find.
No, it's not quite as crude as that. But all papers have their editorial positions, and if you're working for a newspaper that's editorial position would be pro this policy, you might cover it in a different way from a paper whose editorial position was against this policy.
Essentially. Liz, what do you think of this?
I'm trying to, I think I'm like you, James, I'm trying to work out the politics of it. When I saw it happen, I thought to myself, OK, so what Keir Starmer needs to do is win. And he needs to win probably at all costs at this point, because I went to see the musical Guys and Dolls yesterday.
Terrific.
And there's a song in Guys and Dolls at the very end. It's the second to last song. After they do Sit Down, You're Rocking the Boat, everyone's like, this is amazing. And then the two dolls, the key doll characters, come on and they sing a song which the feminist in me finds offensive. The gay musicals fan in me thinks, let's do it. It says, marry the man tomorrow or something. Marry the man today, change him tomorrow.
Yes.
And I think that's Keir Starmer's brief.
Marry.
Get in today, worry about everything else tomorrow. And I think that's what this policy is doing, I think. But I don't know, because the politics is weird.
I agree with you. I think that's absolutely what they're doing. I think it's elect him today, fight him tomorrow is the political way of putting it. And the trouble is that you...
Keir Starmer's not in the musical, just to be clear. He's not one part of it.
I don't know that he's a musical type, but anyway, that's a different matter. But the trouble is with, and I agree with you, that is the thinking, and that is the strategy, and there is an absolute hard-headed pragmatic. I'm not proposing this story, by the way, because I have no sympathy with that hard-headed pragmatic approach. I just think the reason I'm proposing it is because it's a huge talking point. It's because it's something everyone has a view on. You instinctively have a feeling one way or the other. But the trouble with doing whatever it takes to win is it kind of treats politics like a race to the finishing line, and when you get to the finish, like, and we've won, that's it, end. No, that's when it starts. That's when the hard bit starts. That's when you have to actually govern. That's when everything you do, it comes back on you, and everything you have said for the last 5 years suddenly has a practical application. And people are, knocking at your door saying, why haven't you done this? Why, that is the point at which you have to be accountable for the decisions you've taken and doing everything you can to win. OK, you get over the line, and then what? It's like you've married someone, now you've got to live with them for the rest of your life. At that point, maybe the choices you made in the run-up didn't look so good. It wasn't just about the wedding.
I think that we're missing the whole thing here. I'm just sitting here, sorry, Gabby, thinking to myself, can you do the whole of British politics in songs from Guys and Dolls? Can you do Sit Down, You're Rocking the Boat?
Yeah. For sure.
Theresa May's government. I've got the horse right here.
Exactly.
The monarchy. I don't know where all of this
Something
goes.
gives someone a cold. I don't know.
Yes, COVID inquiry. Can we just keep doing the whole thing?
Can we just do that instead?
Yeah,
Why are we bothering with the lead
A
story?
whole different thing. Katie, what do you think of the Starmer child poverty?
I think it's really that idea that we're just meant to trust them and they'll let us know what they're doing later is an extraordinary ask, really. And I'm interested as to why in a way it wasn't framed differently, and I think this is a frustration from members of the Labour Party as well, but you wonder why they're just digging in with the fiscally responsibility above anything else, as opposed to going, well, we really don't like this policy. In fact, most people in our party dislike it a lot, but we think we can't do anything about it because we're not going to have the money, so bear with us. I just don't, for me, it's the framing of it seems very strange.
And that's what I mean by treating it as a story that's about, whether Labour has the political skills, really, to govern through the sort of circumstances it's facing. Because, as you say, there's going to be a lot of saying no. And you either say no in a kind of, the shutters come down, that's it, you can't have what you want, sorry, tough. Or you attempt to give people some kind of hope. We can't do this now, but when, as and when growth restarts, as and when we kickstart the economy, as and when we have more money, these are the things we would like to achieve. Or we can't do this, but we still take child poverty seriously, and this is the other thing that we're going to do. Or this is the, there's not at the moment a great deal of hope. There's a lot of no. And not a lot more.
There's one really big issue here, which is whether or not that fundamental choice, the choice that Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves are making, essentially to say we are going to stick within the tax spending and debt limits set by the coalition and this Conservative government, is the right choice for the country. And that's the piece of this that seems hardest to understand, which is whether or not they really think that they can make Britain better on the existing budget.
And whether even those existing spending plans are feasible. Because if you look at, the way the last few budgets have been structured is to put in a load of public spending cuts for straight after the election, because that's not this government's problem. That's someone else's problem. And you feel that even if by some, you know, say there was some totally unexpected kind of upheaval and for some reason Labour messed it up or the Tories suddenly brilliantly snatched victory from the jaws of defeat or whatever, I'm not even sure that an incoming Conservative government would stick to its spending plans, and yet Labour is currently saying it would.
There was one thing that really interested me about this was just the dynamics of politicians and the way in which they see the world. So there was an exchange between Tony Blair and Keir Starmer at the Future of Britain conference, and what you feel with Keir Starmer is he's saying, hey Tony, I get it. I'm going to be responsible in the way you showed people you're responsible in 96, 97 and won. Weirdly, we've just seen Liz Truss play the I get it. Margaret Thatcher was a low taxation, you know, free enterprise conservative. You know, the world moves on. That's the risk we've got here, is that people are playing old political playbooks, trying to emulate their kind of political icons, and the world's changed.
It's a bit mini-me, and also the trouble is Liz Truss is not Margaret Thatcher. Keir Starmer, I'm not sure, is Tony Blair. And somehow seeing the two of them side by side, you felt as if any minute now, kind of Blair was kind of dying to kind of leap in and kind of show how it should be done. It was there was slightly master and apprentice vibe about it that was all a bit concerning.
I've got this, yes.
Yeah.
Let's take a pause for a moment, and then we're going to come back to Liz's story, going postal. All right.
That was for the ad break for the podcast.
Thank you very much, yes. Yeah. No, it's just a pause, just a breath. You know, sometimes you just need that in life. Go slowly. Liz, what have you got?
I'm pitching my second favourite category of news story. You know my first favourite is the reverse news mullet, which is a story that seems like it's fun, it turns out it's serious. This is my second favourite category. It's called the rage maintenance story, otherwise known as the gift that keeps on giving. It's a story that's so terrible in its impact and detail, and it goes on for so long, but each new terrible detail is genuinely new, so there's always a new thing to be cross about. And this story is the post office scandal. It's been going on for nearly 25 years. It's a long time for a story to be happening. And just as background, although I know people will know about this, it's been reported a lot, between 2000 and 2014, 700 post office managers, sub-postmasters and things ended up with criminal convictions for theft, false accounting and fraud. Some of them went to prison, many of them financially ruined. Some have taken their own lives since. Absolutely horrendous scenario, because the IT system, which is called Horizon, was built by Fujitsu, a software company, that was implemented to manage the post office accounts, basically the money coming through when you go and buy stamps and what have you, didn't work. And it looked like the people who were running the post offices were nicking the money, but they weren't. It was because the computer system was broken. So that's the sort of origin of the story. There is a statutory independent inquiry, led by a chap called Sir Wyn Williams, which is ongoing at the moment. And just the last two details that have happened most recently. Last week he declared the post office, the current management team of the post office's disclosures to be grossly unsatisfactory, because the night before the inquiry was due to hear crucial evidence of one of the engineers from Fujitsu, one of the people that built the system, the post office found 4,767 documents relevant to the inquiry that they hadn't yet managed to disclose, causing the evidence to have to be deferred. And then on Monday, Sir Wyn Williams published a report for Parliament recommending urgent clarification and new legislation to make the 3 separate schemes that people affected by this scandal can use to claim for compensation, to make them fair.
And can I just check, because you're right, this is a story that has gone on for years and years and years, and always ends up in the bottom half of the bulletin, inside the paper, because it's gone on for years and years. That said, wasn't the last time that we had a real rage moment, I'm going to get my timings on this, a couple of weeks ago, when the bonus
of the chief executive came out. When was that?
So Nick Reed, the current CEO of Post Office, enjoyed a £455,000 bonus last year, and he gave 3% of it back because that was how much he thought was related to his exposure to the Horizon inquiry. 3% of that.
So that infuriated a lot of people.
Yeah, at the end of May, there was another one at the end of May, which was the discovery of the racial profiling that the Post Office had in place for its postmasters' staff, where they had been categorised according to Negroid types, and it was something disgusting like dark-skinned European types.
So let's try and do something which goes against the grain of this story, which is let's try and work out what you do if you're currently running the Post Office. So you didn't put in place the Horizon scheme. You aren't Paula Venables, is that the name of the woman who ran it years ago?
Yeah, she was the CEO at the time, yeah.
Now a vicar.
Now a vicar.
She's a minister.
You're trying, in good conscience, to answer the inquiry, resolve the compensation scheme, and also, by the way, run the Post Office. Your day job is not the inquiry. Is it fair, then, to say that what's continuously happening here is that history is revisiting the Post Office, and it's fair for Nick Reed to say, look, I'm trying to do this, but it is not the majority of my job. I have a job to do, which is ensure that the Post Office currently works. That's my priority.
I would pick up two things in that question. Firstly, this is a statutory inquiry, and Nick Reed is bonusing his senior management team for cooperating with it. So they're being financially remunerated for cooperating with a statutory inquiry, which seemed to me quite an unusual set of circumstances. And then the other thing is Sir Wyn Williams, better placed than I am to comment on this. He is remaining open-minded, but isn't ruling out, this was a statement he made this week, that the failure to disclose relevant documentation could be deliberate. So to your point about the current management team of the Post Office, in good conscience, trying to do their best, they're running the Post Office, that's not easy. There's this inquiry, it's obviously a big time drain. He's remaining open-minded, but he hasn't ruled out that they're purposefully not disclosing documentation.
And how much, Liz, are you wound up by what's just happened, what's just revealed, or how much is the fury rooted in the fact that this terrible thing happened and it never quite got the attention, it's never got the kind of public currency that other scandals, your Philip Schofields, your, you know, heaven knows, like we can run through a whole list of them, but it doesn't seem to cut through in the same way. So how much are you just trying to go after this story because you're infuriated by the way in which it's failed to cut through?
I think it's incumbent on us as a newsroom to shine a light on these types of things. So yes, I'm infuriated about the awful power imbalance and the dreadful scenario that these people who were in there, the postmasters I mean, doing their best to do their jobs in very difficult circumstances, the spine of the community, the dreadful things that happen to them. Absolutely, that's the start point of it. But the fact that the inquiry's scope just keeps getting wider and the duration of it keeps getting longer because more new things that are happening now keep coming to light.
So the thing that you don't like, the thing that you think is leading the news is that they don't get it.
Nobody is being held accountable still. Even now, it's not like the haemophilia thing, which happened and it was terrible, but it finished and then it's been looked back on.
But I think
this isn't that.
I think if you look into it, people will say that took a long, long time for people to really get to grips with it.
But it wasn't the original crime, or I don't know if it was a crime, the original thing stopped happening and then we were looking back. With this, it's still happening. The cover-up, the obfuscation, like as you say, the not getting it, how serious this is, it's still happening.
And what about I'm trying to think myself into the shoes of the people inside the Post Office that say, look, I understand how upset you are. I understand how infuriated you are about the people who died without ever getting justice or compensation, the people, as you say, who took their own lives, the people who did get compensation and then got half of it or most of it taken away by the taxman. I get all of that. But the truth is that
we work in the post office. We put in place a computer system. It didn't work. We didn't realise it didn't work. It appeared to us that there had been mistakes that were made, perhaps deliberately, and we pursued those. You keep on trying to find someone to blame. We can't pin it on a person. We can't find you the guilty. It was a failure, a systems failure. So what do you say to people who say that?
I say Wyn Williams is the one that would tackle those questions, because I think I'm right in saying that Paula Venables had 3 separate internal inquiries that she did into the system that told her it was broken, but they maintained it wasn't. And they themselves, these were private prosecutions for the most part, they took their own staff to court when they knew it was breaking. And I think that's the issue.
Katie, what do you think?
I think that last point, because they did have some idea. They essentially did a mass gaslighting of all these sub-postmasters over a long period of time, from I think 2000 to 2014. And after a while, these reports came in, which did indicate things weren't quite as they seemed, and they carried on. So I think it's hard not to be really exercised about the story, because I think it is an extraordinarily bad miscarriage of justice that's gone on for a long period of time. But what makes it interesting is that it's bubbling along now. And going back to your point about standing in the shoes of the people at the post office, I mean, at the very least, the issue, making sure that the right documents, I mean, be helpful, give them everything they need. Surely that's the quickest way to get everyone to get some sort of closure.
What do you think, Gabby?
They're the hardest ones to deal with, aren't they? The slow burn stories where you feel like they never quite get over the line to sort of somehow, and is this the week or is that the week? Or you feel like when Paula Venel, or the Reverend Paula Venel, I presume she is now, takes the stand eventually at the inquiry, that is going to be a huge week, you know, where hopefully you would get the sense of someone being held to account for it. And this isn't quite that week in news terms, but, you know, it's an emotionally devastating story, and it feels like it should have its moment in the sun at some point. You know, it has deserved more coverage than it's had.
Liz, the reason why, I mean, I know that they had enough indication along the way to say something is deeply wrong, and we are getting this wrong. We, the leadership. The reason I keep going back to this bonus point is that that's the moment that I find hardest to understand in the recent history of things, because the 4,000 odd documents, the reality is large organisations are endlessly finding things. I hadn't appreciated the point about it being deliberate, or the allegation that it's deliberate. But the bonus thing is absolutely bewildering to me, because you have to have the HR department sit around saying, look, one of the things we need to do is incentivise people to cooperate with the inquiry. Then the chief executive has to say, yes, that's a good idea. Let's give people bonuses for cooperating with the inquiry. Then the board has to say, good idea. Let's make sure that people get extra money for cooperating with the inquiry. And the fact that at no stage did they stop and go, well, of course we have to cooperate with the inquiry, not just because it's statutory, but because it's reputationally essential.
So I think there's only one shareholder in the post office, isn't there? Isn't that the government?
Us.
Yeah.
But the board is appointed by the government, isn't it?
Yeah.
Actually, we need to know more about that. All right. Gabby, would you have the story lead? Given that it's incremental this week, will you wait until Paula Venel takes the stand?
I sort of feel like that's the big moment. Paula Venel is the big moment. But then, you know, it depends. Again, it's one of those things where it depends what news organisation we are. If I'm a Sunday newspaper, maybe I just decide that now is the week that I go really big and I don't wait for everyone to cover it when Paula Venel is on the stand or whatever. Or, you know, if I'm a slow news organisation, for example, maybe I decide that a slow burn story is the one I do. But if I am, you know, a daily newspaper, I'm thinking there's a lot of other urgent things crowding in on me this week, and this is a bit, you know, its moment will come, but this is not its moment. There's a lot of other things I need to take priority over this week.
All right. Gabby, I should explain. The way this works, if you listen before... It would help if I knew the rules, yeah. ...is that I'm going to have a go at trying to work out what should lead the news, but I'm going to ask you each which story you would choose, but you're not allowed to choose your own.
OK, well, if I'm not choosing my own, I mean, really compelling cases have been put forward for both of them, but I am inclined to go with grain because I think it's a I think it's a moving story militarily, economically. It's got big implications, and I'm a bit swayed by the fact, to be honest, that Russia's just bombed a grain warehouse, and I'm thinking, okay, that pushes it up the agenda a little bit more than it would otherwise be.
Katie?
I don't think I would go for Labour and Starmer, though. I think it's a really interesting story. There's something about we're just going to do the same as those guys and hope for the best. There's something slightly deadening about it as a story. They want to see it like it's 1997, and it just doesn't feel that way. So I think I'd go Post Office. I'm worried that Paula Venables may take ages to come to the stand. I don't think there's a date for her appearance, so maybe she never will. And particularly as a slow news organisation, it feels to me that there's so much in there and so much that's not being covered. I'd go for that.
All right, well, I'll have a go. It's not an easy one, because actually each... Liz, what are you pointing at?
Your verdict. Oh, which one I would pick?
Oh,
yes.
Oh, yeah, sorry, Liz,
I'm going to pick...
Sorry about that. Hi, Liz, how's it going?
Hello, good.
Liz,
Thank you for asking my opinion. I'm going to pick Keir Starmer.
Because?
Because I would really like for somebody to sort of handhold me through the politics of that decision.
All right. I am confused. They're difficult, these stories, because each one of them, in their own way, is indicative of a bigger issue. Grain, what's really happening in Ukraine, what's yet to come in the rest of the world in terms of famine and migration. Keir Starmer, who is he? What is a Labour government really going to do versus what it's going to say? And of course, the Post Office is in itself a story partly about institutional failure, partly about the process of government getting to grips with it, the inquiry, but also the media itself, and a kind of nearly but not quite coverage over the years. And it's funny, I was thinking about this week, it's just been a week of what I think of as staging post stories. You know, Eli Lilly's trial, that's quite significant, really significant in terms of Alzheimer's and treatment of dementia. The inflation numbers, they're there, but they're not significantly moving from very high levels. You know, you can go on and on. The story that we covered, the Crispin Odey story, has finally got to Parliament. It's finally beginning to get some scrutiny, and yet nothing definitive has happened. Seems though Australia's fallen out of love with the Commonwealth Games. The Barbie movie's not as good as we hoped. You know, there's a lot to deal with.
I can't believe we didn't pitch that.
I think my retrospective
Huge news.
Massive news. But I think I'd run it like this. I think that the Keir Starmer story is probably as telling as we're going to get about his politics and about the fundamental economic and political calculation of Labour. It is also not a change in people's lives, and it is a story about a fight for the political direction of Labour within Labour, something that's not yet resolved. And so for that reason, I think it's indicative, but not a lead. Ukraine, I take Gabby's point about if this happens, if that happens, so it's not, again, decisive, but it is going to have a very meaningful impact on cost of grain, cost of fertiliser, food prices, and I think it's one of those stories that will go underreported and have a ripple effect. But I think the point that Liz made, which is this is a story that keeps on giving but doesn't keep on landing, makes me think the news is to choose. And we can choose to put that story at the top because we can choose to spotlight the still cultural failure of the Post Office and the extent to which this inquiry in Wynne Williams has a chance to turn it around. So my running order, for what it's worth, would be Post Office, Ukraine grain, Keir Starmer. But, given we've got an audience, I'm going to check whether I was right. Who would lead on Keir Starmer? Hands up.
Thanks, guys.
Brutal.
An old friend of Gabby Hinsliff is with us.
Like you.
Who here would lead on grain? And who here would lead on the Post Office? Interestingly, 47% of people said grain. Yeah, exactly. It's 48-52. All right, well, listen, before we wrap this up, and Rebecca's going to tell me lots of things I've got wrong and I've got to re-record, I'd love to hear what people think we should have had, whether there were other stories, whether or not the way in which we judged it. Obviously, the majority of people think I judged it wrong. Hang on a second. Liz, you went Keir Starmer.
Yes.
Katie, you went Post Office.
And I went grain.
Oh, you see, you've just got that touch. You know what people are interested in. We're so removed, Gabby. That's it. All right. What thoughts? What do people think? Yes. I can't see anyone, so please tell me your name.
It's Mila.
Oh, hello.
I guess maybe this is a bit dark. I know that the post office story was dubbed the kind of slow burn story, but I feel that the slow burn story of this week is the record-breaking heat wave that's sweeping across, the whole world at the moment. It's a year on from the UK's kind of record-breaking heat, and it's really terrifying turning on the news and seeing wildfires just spreading across the whole world. That really feels to me like one of the biggest stories of this week.
So this is either an explanation or an indictment of the news meeting. We led on the heatwave on Monday when we recorded. So the explanation is, well, that's the reason why we haven't done that again today. The indictment is, it's still the biggest story in the world. So maybe you just have to accept that. It's still the biggest story in the world, and we have to think of new ways of doing it. Yes. Thanks, Mark.
Hello, I'm Jade. Kind of riding on the wave of climate environmental pictures. Finally, for the first time in a year, the US and China, the two biggest emitters in the world, have met and are finally trying to talk about how they can curb emissions and move forward. And it's the first time, that it's been a whole year since the Nancy Pelosi thing. And also, I think it's a huge step between mending relations between those two countries. As we know, they're very tense. So I would say that's a very big story at the moment.
So, I think that is a massive story, and I think it's been incredibly badly covered, because all I've really seen is pictures of the two of them meeting.
Yeah.
Got no idea what was really said.
Exactly.
And also this whole story has been couched in terms of two people who haven't talked to each other now talking to each other without anyone telling us what they said.
What they spoke about. Apparently it was a one-on-one dinner. That's all we know.
It's going to be one of those journalistic classics. You never find out what they said, but you do discover the menu.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so my name is Frank. I think there's a story in Thames Water going on right now. I saw Darren Jones giving Catherine Ross a hard time, and he started one of his questions with, "Would you like to apologise?" So I think there's a potential for Thames Water running out of water. There's a potential for a story about the revolving door of a former head of the regulator becoming the head of the company. So I think there's a number of different dynamics there. I think there's also the story about select committees doing their job and giving people a hard time.
And just out of interest, do you think that question, do you want to apologise, is a good question or a bad one?
I think it makes for good clips on YouTube. I think it's a good question, and rightly, she was being. It was a question that focused, that asked someone to focus on a statistic about. So it was 60%, and now it's 70%. Would you like to apologise for that?
What do you think, Amy?
Journalistically, it's a great question because all the answers to it are bad. It's like if you say, no, I don't want to apologise, I'm not remotely sorry, you sound awful. And if you say, yes, I feel like I really have been calling you, that's not like a strong opening. So it's a great device to open, and Darren Jones is very good at those. It's a great device. Whether it gets you to the heart of what the actual matter before the select committee,
being a professional, she dodged it really well,
yeah.
And that's why she's got the job she's got.
That's why they pay the big bucks for media training.
Yep.
Hi, I'm Madeline, and I'm sort of wondering how we shift our attention to sort of what this country is, like sort of who are we at the moment? And it's sort of in all your stories, and that comment sort of, the biggest story in the world at the moment. So what is that? But it's this thing in our culture and country that we seem to really care about dogs, and they sort of seem to be everywhere, and people don't seem to have any awareness that you might not like them or welcome them. And then we can't seem to culturally or politically or globally or economically sort of care enough about child migrants or refugees to come up with a sort of sustainable, reasonable solution. And so I'm just sort of wondering, how do we sort of square this, weird, frankly, addiction we have to dogs and new dog food and dog bowls and dog things with not giving enough of any kind of attention to refugees and migrants?
Liz Mosley Unleashed.
Thank you. I feel so seen. I don't know how you turn your care for dogs into care for people. I guess dogs. I don't know what it is about dogs. I genuinely, I can't help.
I've got a dog. Me and my dog would like to take issue with this question.
No. Actually, the reason why I love it is this is an area where you are up against a sort of cult-like acceptance of what is good and what's right. And how do you get that voice, right? Not to the dislike of dogs, the dislike of people like us who like dogs. That's the really great bit of this. I've no idea, Madeline, how you do that. How you say, okay, look, we are the disliker of dog lovers party, and we are going after you, dog lovers, for your excessive mawkishness and warmth towards dogs. We've got quite a few, by the way, in Tortoise, because there are people who've got dogs, they bring dogs into the office, we all say how cute that is, and then a few people huddle together. So there's a community there that I think you might tap into, small but strong.
If your policy is like, death...
Policy? You've got a party now.
If your policy is death for people who refer to themselves as their dog's mummy, then I'm 100%. Or people who buy dog ice cream, or people who ask why their dog can't come into name of place their dog obviously shouldn't be.
I like it when they mix in the dog product and the person product next to each other on a shelf. Like, here are the biscuits that's dog biscuits, and then here are the nice shortbreads that's not for dogs. In the hotel. I was literally in at the weekend. Yes, and it was like, we're really dog-friendly, like, this is a cool dog-friendly place. I was like, well, I'm not dog-friendly. Keep your stinking mutt away from me on my holiday.
Funny enough, a friend of mine had just called their dog Steve, and I like the idea of kind of probably bringing things a little closer together, but that's not going to help you, Madeline, because your party is against that kind of cutesy anthropomorphizing of dogs.
Well, just a bit pro-refugee.
But yeah, I was going to say,
you've like now ladled on the guilt here. That's totally unfair.
It's possible to like dogs and refugees.
Yes.
Is it about cats? Otherwise,
Hi, Jonas. I was just thinking about the Thames Water story and how it connects to the post office story, because there's a question of governance, and we have two examples of, frankly, a whole system, like the water company system that's been privatized, failing, right? And there is a governance question there, and there is a big failure of governance in the post office story. And I'm wondering whether that, because I was with Ukraine, but if there is a bigger story actually behind this question of how do you govern public services in a way that works, I think I'm actually then probably more on the post office story. And I think that the two connect in some way, because it's about leadership of public services, right?
There's an interesting thing which also connects to Gabby's story, because I don't agree, as you can hear from the question I asked Gabby, with the idea that the right direction for our country is to stick within the existing envelope. I think we've got to figure out, given public service pressures, global competitiveness, structural decline, how we invest for this next decade in the remainder of the century. So I don't agree with that position. But if you take the view, Conservative and Labour, which is we want to have
tax as a percentage of GDP around 35%, and we want to have debt to GDP at around 100%, and we're not going to move either of those things, then our politics becomes this very strange animal, which is not the what, but the how. And the how, I think, becomes an argument essentially between the right and the left over private and public. And in that context, what you're really trying to figure out is how much can the private sector do, if you're on the right, to reduce demand and the expectations of the public sector, or if you're on the left, what you're trying to say is, no, we believe that the scale of public sector operations creates their own efficiencies and improves services for individuals. And the question, I think, that ties the Thames Water to the post office is, how do you create cultures of responsibility and accountability? And the reason why I think it's really problematic is that Thames Water is Exhibit A on private irresponsibility and Post Office on public irresponsibility. You don't necessarily have an easy answer on either of those things. But they are connected. I see exactly your point, Jonas.
Yeah, I think there is a point around, so I work in the charity sector, and one thing that's really interesting in this whole debate between public and private sector is when you think about what does benefit mean, what does value creation mean? In the private sector, and this is, for example, with Thames Water, right? In the private sector, the system is set up for shareholder value and so on and so forth. That's what the system defines. It's not necessarily what needs to be done, but that means profit is maximum, and you define success by income by default, unless you have enough room to do something else. And in the charity sector or in the public sector, you need to define success differently, right? Through impact or effectiveness. And I think the question you're asking is, what is the right answer, the right balance between the two?
Totally.
And it's a massive
question. Gabby, what do you think?
I mean, I think you're right. I think the complicating wrinkle here, of course, is that we're dealing, with the water industry and with a number of other industries we could mention, with industries that sit between public and private. Yeah. They're privatised industries that deliver a public good and that we kind of vaguely think would have a public sector ethos, sort of, a bit. But, they're not public sector companies, and they don't behave like public sector companies, and yet we're relying on them to deliver something that we, consider as sort of an essential to everyday life, and that's the bit that you can't get round and over, really. What should they be? Should they have a different culture? If you're privatising a public sector, do you expect it to behave in a different way than any other private company? And we've kind of assumed it would and then left it to it.
I'm going to, forgive me, wrap up. I hope we'll stick around. Dog lovers over here, Madeline in the corner over there, and talk about these stories and others that we no doubt have missed. But I'm going to wind up the recording so that we've got that, and we've got something that sort of hopefully hangs together. So I'm just going to finish off here, and then no doubt you're going to tell me things. You have notes. Well, so those are the stories. No, hang on a second, that's not what I'm saying. Obviously, I didn't read any of the notes, forgive me. So that's the run of stories, and let's face it, there are many more for this week. As I said, you can email us about the stories that we cover on the news meeting, ones that you think that we've missed, ones that you think we should have covered, but possibly in a different order. Please just send your thoughts to newsmeeting@tortoisemedia.com. And I thought you'd be interested. I'm just going to read a couple that have come in since Monday's episode. You might remember that we had a discussion. And Basha Cummings' story about heat waves across Europe. In fact, heat waves in the US, in Japan, heat waves all across the Northern Hemisphere dominated that discussion. Here's what we learned. Jade said, journalists have failed to enlighten readers and the public at large about the attainability and benefits of a low-carbon life. I was shocked to hear that to date no climate story has led the news on your podcast. And then David said, while in the UK, we have been reducing... sorry, and then I'll say that again. Sorry, Rebecca. And then David said,
While in the UK, we have been reducing carbon emissions for 30 years, you'd get the impression from most of the media we've been sitting on our hands. We're being bombarded by messaging designed to induce guilt, but we can't even build a zero-carbon nuclear power station without protests from so-called environmentalists like Greenpeace. Given that we're joined by people in the newsroom, hang on a second, that's not in the quote. Those were just a couple of points of view. I'm sure there are many others listening to us. In this podcast, you'll have views too. Please let us know. Given that we're joined by people in the... Oh, no, I'm going to have just done that. Blah, blah, blah.
That's fine. That's fine.
So I know I'm just winding up.
Yep.
Okay. Well, with that, that's it for this episode of the News Meeting. Thank you to Liz and Katie for joining us. A particular thank you to you, Gabby, for coming in and joining us too. Thanks to you for listening, and thanks to our audience here in the Tortoise Newsroom. Thanks very much for coming in. I'm away for the next couple of weeks on holiday, praise be, praise be. But Liz is going to be here in the editor's chair.
Also praise be.
And so please join her then. But for today, thank you very much for joining us on the News Meeting.
Lovely.
Thank you.
Well done. I only have 2 notes.
You're being very generous. It can be vicious with the editor's scalpel.
My only note is, can you just ask Liz for her vote one more time?
Just to humiliate me?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, God, I'll do that.
You don't have to give it.
Liz, what would you choose?
Smooth. That was good. Hear the edit on Friday. Nice. And just the intro, if that's all right. It will require clapping.
We need to coordinate this. Mark and I need to get this one together.
All right, page 3, please.
Page 3.
Your cue is me shouting at you.
Okay.
No. It's this and then this.
Oh. It's very hard to work with these people. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, we should get the better ones next time.
Hello, I'm James Harding. This news meeting is recorded in front of an audience here in the Tortoise Newsroom. Actually, I'm going to do that all again. I sound like I'm opening a funeral.
It's a career funeral, James.
We're laying to rest. You, James Harding. Thank you very much.
I'm really hungry.
Oh, sorry, carry on. Hello. Hello, I'm James Harding. We're recording this episode of the News Meeting in front of an audience here in our newsroom at Tortoise. Later, we're going to hear what they think about the stories that we're about to discuss, and no doubt they'll tell us the stories that we've missed, stories that we should have put in a different order. But of course, you could do the same thing. Please do email us and let us know what you think of the judgments we make at the Tortoise News Meeting, and you can do that simply by emailing newsmeeting@tortoisemedia.com. Let's get on with things. From Tortoise, welcome to the News Meeting. Thank you very much. I'm laid to rest. Dinner time, Mark. Thank you very much for coming. It's really good of you. Thank you very much.